Well, thank you, Serena. Thank you for the invite. Thank you, everyone, for coming online tonight. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about woody species control. When Serena first contacted me and asked me to do this, I thought, yep, no problem. I've actually done a lot of talks, especially on aspen control and integrated control of aspen in Alberta. And then Serena kind of expanded the topic a little bit and said, well, you know, a lot of our producers are kind of struggling with some shrub encroachment issues, namely Western snowberry and rose, prickly rose, wild rose encroachment into pastures. And so I've taken my former talk, adapted it quite a bit, and I've actually included a lot of contemporary kind of control perspectives, mostly around herbicides. That may be what you're looking for, may not be. But you're going to see, I'll talk more so about aspen in the first half of the talk, and then I'll kind of switch gears. And I'll probably spend the latter half for sure talking about different herbicide control options. Folks that know me, and Hillary knows me very well, know that I love to talk about data. And so I will share with you all kinds of data slides. And so I'll ask for your forgiveness in advance, but I'll walk you through it. And I really believe that the data and a data slide is worth 1,000 words, because it will kind of show what some of the existing state of the knowledge is in terms of what are the options available to control these different woody species. Do they work? And if you're going to use that approach, what is the optimal, let's say, herbicide concoction, mix, and rate, and so on. So I'm going to be talking about a lot of those different herbicides. Whether you decide to use them or not is entirely up to you. I've even reached out to some of my industrial colleagues here in Alberta, and I've got some news to share on a new herbicide that's actually coming out this year, and it's going to be available in BC, limited availability, but it is coming down the pike. And so I will talk about that one as well, and it may be something that some of your producers may be very interested in using. Okay, so kind of a roadmap of what I'm going to cover. We're going to talk a little bit about the context of woody species and also the critical role of livestock grazing, and in terms of how that might actually trigger increases in encroachment and things like that. I'll also talk a little bit about land ownership. Alberta is about 2/3 private land, or public land. And I know that formula in BC is even larger. It's 80–90%. It's large. And so if you're talking about woody species control on public land, your options might be a little bit different, because then you need to work with your regional range management specialists and trying to figure out what you do and what can't you do. Most of the herbicide material will be very topical for private land, obviously. Private grazing leases where producers have more flexibility to figure out what to do. We will talk about the agronomic impacts of woody species. And I will tell you right up front that I don't think we should be striving to eliminate all woody species. In fact, some of these woody species can be very effective forms of forage. We've found that at the work that we've done east of Edmonton in the Kinsella area, Kinsella Research Ranch, which is in the Aspen Parkland, but work down there for the last 40 years has been showing that certain shrubs, including aspen, have considerable forage value. So I don't think we should take the blanket policy that all of those shrubs are necessarily bad. We'll talk about some of the control options, and I emphasized herbicides in that, but we will talk about some other opportunities, such as the use of grazing, and specifically mob grazing or high density grazing as a form of biological control, and maybe even the use of fire. And I know that fire probably isn't likely to be used, but we'll talk about where and when it might be a tool. And I'll target those 3 species: trembling aspen, that I've got the most experience with, wild rose as well, and then western snowberry or buckbrush. And so hopefully that'll give you a well-rounded out perspective. Again, I just want to emphasize, I'm very familiar with Alberta. I'm less familiar with BC, but I believe that the context is fairly similar, that you're dealing with a significant tract of public land, significant lease area, publicly grazed lands, where those lands, you're trying to manage your livestock within there. Shrubby expansion, if you like, within there, but you also need possibly to get the approval of your public land agency, especially if it's critical wildlife habitat and things like that. And then we've got all of our private land. So many of these options, especially the herbicides, are going to be very applicable to the private land context. Okay, the other thing to note in Alberta anyways, and I don't know how much of this kind of two-pronged situation you've got in BC, but we have two real situations, and they're very different from one another in terms of how we view woody plant encroachment. One of them is where woody species are expanding into what I would call our natural parkland environments, which are typically, at least historically, maybe only 20, 30, 40% aspen. And what we have essentially through fire suppression is a very significant expansion within the landscape of those wooded communities. And so some areas, for example, at our Kinsella Research Station, we've gone up to 80, 90% aspen, starting out at as little as 20, 30% in the early 1900s. And so the Peace River Parkland in Alberta would apply the same way. And I would imagine that sizable areas in northeastern British Columbia also fall into this category as well. Then we've got our boreal forest environments where we're really talking about pretty much land clearing and replacement of boreal forest with some kind of tame forage environments. And in those areas, so that's more so at the interface of the you know, where our private land is blending into our public land on grazing reserves and so on. Where we have those clearings, we very commonly see woody plant regrowth, you know, aspen, snowberry, rose, and then it becomes a matter of how do we make sure we protect the investment that we've put into that area of clearing away the trees, planting our tame forage, and making sure we don't lose too much of our beneficial productivity for livestock. And so, you know, that picture there in the lower right that Serena very graciously sent to me, that's an example of that. And we have a lot of that in Alberta, and I understand you're dealing with a lot of that in BC. So there are very strong parallels between what you guys are experiencing over there and here. And that's why I think that there's an awful lot of synergies. The other thing I'll point out, and I won't say much more of this after this slide, but Alberta has gone through a really interesting kind of life cycle. And I call it a life cycle because it's literally been evolving over time. And that is the attitudes that both, private ranchers and even public lands has had towards how they perceive and how they treat shrub encroachment and aspen encroachment issues. For example, in the 1960s and 1970s, my predecessor at the University of Alberta spent most of his career really trying to figure out how to kill aspen, largely because it was considered a weed where it was encroaching in the parkland or encroaching into these tame forage clearings in the boreal. And so a lot of the work was on targeted control. How do we get rid of it? How do we get rid of it? But nowadays, we've expanded our thinking considerably. And there's three considerations now. One is we recognize the value of those aspen stands in some cases, not only because they can provide a pretty good quality source of forage, but also for other integrated land uses, so wildlife, biodiversity, and so on. But then we also still have that kind of hardcore area on private land where producers are very much trying to protect their investment, where they've cleared the forest and the woody species are coming up. So we have all three of those simultaneously going on. And the options available are very heavily dependent on, is it private land? Is it public land? And what is the primary kind of land use emphasis? Is it for multiple use or is it primarily for forage production? And so I'll leave it at that, but I'm pretty sure there's a lot of this going on in British Columbia as well. And so there's a lot of dialogue over where should we be using herbicides, to what extent, and so on, to protect our investments in terms of forage productivity conservation. I just want to point out, you know, that there is lots of good data to indicate that aspen encroachment has been very pervasive in Western Canada. And this is true in Saskatchewan, it's true in Alberta, and I'm sure it's true in significant areas in northeastern British Columbia as well. These are some long-term transects from Kinsella one of our university ranches, showing basically we went from a little over 5% in the early 1900s to over 50%, which is, you don't notice that over a 2 or 3 year period, but you notice it over a 20-year period. And you certainly notice it over a 60-year period, because you've gone from a landscape where aspen are sporadic and intermittent to basically now forming more than half of the landscape. Excuse me. And I can tell you that this data, this pattern of change has continued, so that the Kinsella Research Ranch actually peaked out in the late 1970s, early 1980s at as much as 85% aspen. So if you don't do anything, you're basically taking a parkland environment, which was largely grassland, producing a lot of forage for livestock, and converting it over into boreal forest. Now, why do we care about that? We care largely because we're losing a whole lot of productivity. And so if you look at the, the comparison of our typical grassland environment, where we might be getting a couple thousand kilograms per hectare, we're typically only getting about a quarter of that, somewhere around 500 kilograms of herbage. Now, excuse me, does that mean that that's the only amount of forage that's being produced? And that's not necessarily the case, because as I said earlier, some of the understory of these aspen stands can actually be producing quite a bit of usable browse. And that might surprise some people, but those of you that have got deciduous aspen stands know that your livestock will be very willing to utilize the forage that's underneath there. The other thing that I do want to point out, though, is when you get a massive shift from, let's say, 10% aspen to 60% or 80% aspen, what you also have is, if you don't change your stocking rates adaptively, you're going to overgraze the remaining area of grassland. And by overgrazing the remaining area of grassland, what that means is that the herbage is now less competitive against the woody species, which means they in turn are going to accelerate in terms of their encroachment. So the point I'm trying to get at here is, if you're not adjusting on the fly for those changes in carrying capacity, you will eventually make the problem of woody plant encroachment worse. And that's the main point that I'm getting, which means you need to make a fundamental decision. Are you going to adjust your stocking rates, or are you going to go in and control the woody species? It's decision time. Okay, the other reason why there's a little bit of urgency to maybe going and controlling these woody species is, we know that where you have a relatively productive soil, let's say either a black chernozem or an alluviated black chernozem, or even a dark gray chernozem, and those areas get encroached by aspen, or any woody species for that matter, that would apply to snowberry as well, you will actually start to degrade the condition of that soil. So your organic matter will fundamentally start to decline over time. Your total nitrogen content in the soil will decline. And so that represents lost productivity moving forward into the future. So that's something that you really need to be thinking about. Okay, so if we accept the fact that we don't want an unlimited amount of woody coverage in the landscape, and if you've got this encroachment going on, that means it's decision time. That means you need to fundamentally look at, what are the tools available, which ones are you going to use? The tools basically boil down to 4 of them. One of them is mechanical clearing, which I'll only very briefly talk about, because it's not a place that we want to go. We know it's very expensive. The second, and also because if you mechanically clear and you're going to go through the whole renovation, you're looking at a potential opportunity cost of 1 or 2 years where the land is taken out of production, possibly. Another one is prescribed fire, which we've used at the Kinsella Ranch quite successfully. However, the issue there is there's very few people with the expertise to do it and that are willing to take the risk. A third one is prescribed grazing. And so my predecessor, Art Bailey, spent 30 years of his career basically refining the method of prescribed grazing to control aspen. So we know an awful lot about how to kill aspen and some other woody species as well. And then the last one is herbicides. So I already told you, I'm going to focus on herbicides the most, simply because if you're talking about rose and buckbrush as 2 of the focal plants that you're really concerned about, I'll tell you up front, unfortunately, the mechanical clearing, prescribed fire, and prescribed grazing are probably not very good tools. They may work a little bit, especially on rows, but on Western snowberry, you've got one option, and it's herbicide, unfortunately. If you've got aspen as an encroachment issue, all four of those are actually pretty good potential solutions. And the best is to actually integrate them into an integrated form of weed control. Okay. So I'm going to work through these. I'm going to cover them, some of them really quickly, but for completeness, we'll talk about all of them a little bit. So mechanical clearing, yes, it's very fast. Yes, it can be very effective, but it's incredibly expensive. It's a last resort. It's not where we really want to be. You know, I've got some cost estimates up there of $400 or $500 an acre, and that's probably pretty low nowadays. It's probably a lot higher than that, even if you can get some salvage out of it. The reality is this is a last ditch resort, in my opinion. And if you're talking about range improvements that are simply undergoing, you know, aspen or rose or snowberry encroachment, then mechanical clearing is off the list. That's not where we want to go. Okay, we'll start out talking a little bit about herbicides right away here. So one of the very first projects that Art Bailey did, this was back in the late 60s, early 70s, where he looked at the control. Now this is mature aspen, but we're going to get to the regrowth question later on, because I've got lots of data to show you in terms of what are your options with regrowth within existing tame forage. So Art Bailey started out asking the question, okay, how do we control this aspen if we want to get rid of it? So he looked at topical aerial application with fixed wing aircraft or with helicopters. And so he actually looked at, his very first treatment was 0, 4, or 8 pounds per acre of 2,4-D. And this is a 2,4-D ester 700 treatment. And so they basically went out, just sprayed these mixed pastures that had aspen in it, grassland, all kinds of stuff. And then he basically just tracked the herbage production. And the thing I want to point out to you is that the 2,4-D actually worked quite well. So he was able, through as little as 4 pounds per acre of 2,4-D, to basically bump up his forage production from around 200, 300 to as much as 1,000 or more. So, and all that was doing is basically removing the overstory or opening up the canopy. So it's a top kill basically of the vegetation in order to increase what's in the understory. Now, I'll tell you why Art Bailey was doing this, because in large part, he was really trying to open up the overstory so he could get more fine fuel, so he could get at what he was really trying to do, which was light a match and burn it. So until he got enough fine fuel in the understory, he didn't have the option of using fire within these environments. Okay, so but I think the important point here is, interestingly, it shows you that these trees are having a very significant competitive effect on what you're seeing in the understory in terms of herbage availability. And even opening up that overstory, you know, we're seeing this market increase, as much as 4 or 10-fold increase, depending on whether the aspen are healthy and decadent in terms of understory productivity. Okay, so as I said, Art Bailey's real driving factor here with trying to open up the canopy was to get enough fuel so he could start burning. Now, I'm not going to speak too much about burning for 2 reasons. It's not that this is not a good tool. In fact, I would argue this is probably the best tool. And the reason for it is because these rangelands evolved with fire. And while they're relatively fire tolerant, if you have fire at a frequent enough frequency, so if you have enough of it over time, it will keep all of these woody species at bay. The problem is, and the benefit is, it's low cost, okay? $10 to $20 an acre is what it costs us to burn at the Kinsella Ranch. Here's the issue. There's very, very few people that either have the expertise to do this, because it really is a science when we talk about the art and science of implementing a prescribed fire. And there's a fine line between having a train wreck and having a really successful fire. And so there's very few people with not only the expertise, but very few people are willing to take the risk of actually burning. And when I mean risk, I mean not only personal risk, but financial risk. So, and by that, I mean, go out and talk to your insurance provider and see if they'll allow you to actually burn. Because if you ever have a runaway and it gets onto your neighbor's property, you are liable for what that fire started. Now, this is very, very different than jurisdictions in, let's say, Texas, where 98% of the land in Texas is privately owned. And they actually go out of their way as a jurisdiction to encourage burning on private land, because they realize that that's the number one tool that they have to control woody species like mesquite and other invasive species, cedars that are expanding across the Edwards Plateau and elsewhere. And so the state actually makes available, for example, insurance programs for private producers to go out and burn. We're not at that point in Canada, unfortunately. We are lagging greatly behind, and maybe we'll get to that point one day in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. But until we're at that point, unfortunately, I don't see fire as being a routine management tool, even though it's one of the best tools that we actually have and one of the lowest cost tools. And I'd be happy to hear comments on that as well. If someone has comments or experiences on that, if we have time at the end, I'd love to hear them. In terms of prescribed burning, there's usually a very narrow burn window, because a lot of these deciduous forests they're what we call asbestos forests. They don't burn very readily in the summertime. They're so wet, they're so humid, they're so moist. So we usually have a relatively narrow burn window of 2 to 3 weeks in the spring. And even within there, you only get 2 or 3 days of really the right wind and temperature and so on to be able to burn. So it's a very narrow window. And even then, you don't always get the same degree of control. So areas that have got more snow on them, north-facing slopes, may not burn to the same degree. The point that I do want to get to here is that if you ever go out and use fire, most of these boreal species, and that's true of rose, raspberry, it's true of gooseberry, it's true of western snowberry, it's also true of aspen. They're all fire adapted. So the first time you might use fire, you will get significant regrowth. These are all young aspen suckers that are coming up from the root system. So we got a good top kill. You can see the above ground stems are toast, they're dead, but the root is still alive. And so those stems are now coming up from that living root mass. And so our work is not done, because if we leave this, it's going to turn right into these mature aspen forests again. So we're not quite done. So what do? Well, Art Bailey spent 10 to 15 years refining the practice of using targeted grazing, where he basically used mob grazing or rotational grazing. So taking animals, cattle, confining them in relatively smaller paddocks at the right time of the year to basically get pretty good control of these aspen suckers. And he looked at, for example, differences between June grazing, October grazing, at either heavy or light stalking. And if you look at his aspen stem mortality, it's pretty blatant what works the best. Hit them hard and hit them in June. The reason why June is so much better is because woody species go through a process called lignification. And basically that means they start growing in the spring, they produce a shoot. Initially, it's quite tender, which is one of the reasons why cattle are likely to utilize it in May and June. But when it gets into the latter part of July and August, that new growth starts lignifying or turning into actual wood. And when that happens, the palatability declines, the likelihood that cattle will utilize it as a source of forage declines. And that's why this June treatment is so critical. Now, the heavy June treatment worked the best, but it also comes at a bit of a price, because we know that at least in the parkland, you can do a lot of damage to your native grass. So what we generally recommend is either a light June treatment, or if you're going to go heavy June, try to rest it for a year or rest it till late the following year to allow the native to recover, okay? But what I'm trying to get across is that grazing can be a very effective form of biological control for woody species. And those of you that tune in on the 16th of March, where I talk about integrated control of thistle, we're doing the exact same thing with mob grazing, and it has worked like a charm. So I'm going to show you the data on that. It's incredibly effective, even though cattle don't want to necessarily consume aspen or thistle, you can do it. And the good thing is neither of those species are toxic. That's important. You would never do that with a toxic plant. You'd never force them to eat a toxic plant. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, we use some kind of mob-style rotational grazing. We take a big area, we slice it up into smaller paddocks. The smaller paddocks you can get, the better. And nowadays with electric fencing, you can accomplish a lot in terms of subdivision. You can get very tight control over where, when, and how those animals graze. And what you're doing is effectively overriding the selectivity potential of those animals, forcing them to utilize what you want to get biological control of. So this is some work from Mike Alexander's work. Some of you might know Mike. So Mike is actually the lead for the range management branch here in the province of Alberta. He actually did his master's at Kinsella, and he actually looked at using this as a form of biological control in aspen forest. And I just want to show you one of his key results, which I think does a wonderful job. So he looked at moderately grazed and heavily grazed conditions and looked at the biomass production. And there's two pieces to this puzzle. One is the aspen, and you can see the progressive decline under moderate and then heavy grazing. So that's the control that he got by basically forcing these animals to consume aspen. The other one is the release of vegetation in the understory. So that's basically the associated grass and desirable forage response in the understory. And again, you can see that we're getting this boost in productivity. So grazing, very important activity. And I think the key point is, even if you're not going to use mob grazing, make sure you pay attention to the stalking rates that you're employing on your pastures where woody plant encroachment is an issue. Because again, part of this trade-off that we're looking at between whatever your woody species is that you're trying to control and the desirable forage base will arise because of your grazing practices. So if you have too high a stalking rate, and if those animals are targeting only the herbage, that means those plants are going to decline in vigor. They get smaller, their leaf area gets smaller, they're less competitive. And that means that species like aspen or snowberry or whatever can respond because they get more light, they get more water, they get more nutrients. So it's managing that competition within these stands that's really important. If you're going to use mob grazing, you want to do it when the shrubs or the woody species are young, when they're more succulent. And, you know, here, this is basically, again, from Mike Alexander's work. He very clearly showed it's all about timing. You have to hit them the first year when they're trying to recover. It's because when those plants are relatively small, they still haven't built up a big root mass. They haven't built up a lot of carbohydrate reserves. So you can get very high utilization and you can get very high mortality on those shrubs. So that's the time to do it. So if you're going to create a new range improvement, let's say an arboreal lease, it's all about trying to manage that regrowth early on, because if it gets to the point where it starts to get really big, it gets away on you, and then your options are limited and you're stuck using herbicides. Okay. Okay. So where does this leave us? So I'm going to get to the herbicides, and almost the rest of this is all going to be on herbicides with maybe a couple exceptions. I just want to throw in a sales pitch, because I did say this earlier, that aspen, and certainly aspen and some of these other shrubland habitats, can actually be still pretty useful forms of forage for cattle. And so I want to make sure that we're not thinking of all of these woody, you know, habitats as necessarily secondary or not as good. Yes, they may not produce as much, but they can still have a really important role to play. And here's a couple examples. So I had a student a number of years ago that actually looked at using one of these mob grazing, high intensity, low frequency rotational grazing systems at Kinsella, basically looking at the relative utilization and the amount of absolute herbage removal from different habitat types. And we were really pleasantly surprised that the aspen forest actually supplied not only the same amount of herbage, so this is actually what was ingested. This is actually literally what was consumed by animals, by cattle. not only was the absolute amount similar, but the relative use was similar at 55 and 52%. So these aspen forests, you can definitely get animals to utilize them by even implementing this rotational system. So don't think that it's lost habitat completely, because that's not necessarily the case. Mike Alexander also shared, he also looked at some utilization on different woody components as opposed to the herbaceous components. I want to share this with you because it shows how nuanced cattle are with their selectivity. I like to describe it to my undergrads like this. If you go in shopping wherever, Safeway, Costco, I don't care where you're going, okay? There's a lot of food items in there. And every one of us, if we go in with 100 people, every one of us is going to have a different selection pattern because we have different preferences. We're going to select different food items based on what's actually available. So when we're trying to control woody species, we're trying to override an animal's selectivity, their tendency to avoid the broccoli. So if you hate the broccoli, right, then I have to, if I know you don't like broccoli, I'm going to send you to a store that has 3 items and one of them is broccoli. And then you have no choice but to eat the broccoli. You see how that works? I'm not going to send you into Superstore where there's thousands of items where I know you'll never take the broccoli. So the utilization patterns are really interesting, and we normally don't get to see them at this kind of a resolution. So this is a 5-day grazing period. And what he did is he actually tracked the patterns of use. And you can see the herbs. By day 3, there was about 25% use. By day 4, at about 45%. By day 5, he was all the way up to about 65%. Now, that's a little higher than we would probably like. We probably don't want to be over 50, 60%. But you can see there was a lag to the woody species. So the woody species are always behind. They don't want to eat the woody species, but they will if they have to. So day 3, they're at 15, and then they're at 30, day 4. And then even by the time you get into day 5, they're up around 35%. So you have to be kind of thinking about what choices are my animals going to make and how are they going to rank that. Now, there's another example also from Mike's work. And I think this is even more telling because all 3 of our target woody species are on here. So if you look at the same pulse of utilization, so here's 5 days of grazing on here. By the end of day 5, aspen was at about 65%. Pretty good, actually. Really good. But remember, these are freshly regenerating saplings. They aren't 2 years old. They're 1 year old. They're young. They're succulent. They're high protein, high energy. They're still palatable. Look at where the rose is. The rose is only down around 30%, about half of the aspen. So you're going to have a much more difficult time controlling rose than you are aspen. You see that? Because they simply, the animals do not want to, it's, now we're going from, and I hope I don't offend anyone, but now we're going from broccoli to tofu, right? So if the aspen are the broccoli, this is the tofu. And now we've got something that's even worse, which is Western snowberry. We don't even get to 10% utilization. So they just do not want to touch that stuff. So if you're going to try to use grazing to control Western snowberry, you have your work cut out for you. And in all likelihood, you're going to do a lot of damage to your forage stand before you even get to that point. So biological control using grazing works for things like aspen or other palatable species, but not for the real unpalatable ones. And snowberry is by far the worst.
Ed, I might just jump in here. We had a relevant question
Sure.
from Mike Malmberg, specifically about Alexander's work in 94. He asked, is the herbage response the same for the moderate or light grazing? And was the response for 1 year only that was measured?
I believe he actually measured it for multiple years. So that's this graph, but I couldn't cram it all into here. I'd have to go to his actual theses and pull it out. So there were 2 questions. So one of them is, how long did he measure it for? He measured it for at least 2 years, and that was a minimum of 2 years. I do know that. What was the other part of the question?
And was the herbage response the same for the moderate grazing, I think, as compared to the heavily grazed?
Yeah, there is. So when you look at these 2 data points right here, you can see that they're roughly similar. You can see that this one is maybe trending slightly downwards because the question might be, are we imposing a penalty from the heavy grazing? onto the herbage and that we're starting to hurt what's trying to regrow in the understory? The answer to at least the 2 years of use that Mike did, the answer is no. If you did that for 5 years, then yeah, there might be some feedback. You might start to degrade it. So I think it's a really, really good question. I mean, Mike's thesis is 120 pages thick, and I basically had to cherry pick some of the key things. Unfortunately, none of this from Mike's thesis has ever been published, and I work very closely with Mike. I would love to see this published because this is fascinating data, and it really tells us what these animals are doing in terms of, their rank preference and the decisions that they're making when they're trying to eke out a living in these pastures. One other thing that we came across, so the aspen provides all kinds of secondary benefits. So one of the ones I like to cite is always shade in the summertime. So if you get really hot temperatures, or in the wintertime, thermal protection from strong winds, blizzards, things like that. Art Bailey, way back in the early 70s, also observed a really interesting little pattern where when they looked at the preferences, so this is the proportion of foraging time by cattle, during a dry year, he was quite shocked to find that the forests were actually targeted to a greater extent by cattle in the dry year. This is the drought year. So in the wet year, no difference, equal preference. But in the dry year, they targeted the forests. That raises a really interesting question. Why did they do that? Well, it's because in a drought year, when you look at a parkland like this, all those grasslands dry down. So the grasslands shut down growth and the vegetation starts to senesce and therefore is not very attractive to animals anymore. But in the forest, there is a natural advantage that allows the understory to continue to grow. And it wasn't until about 15 years ago that one of my PhD students, George Powell, who's now in BC, and many of you probably know, he did his PhD with me, and he actually discovered that there's a natural benefit in the understory of these forests, which is that they keep a much higher relative humidity. And because they have a much higher relative humidity, the herbage in the understory keeps growing because they're not as moisture stressed. And so interestingly enough, this goes back and explains what the cattle are doing here. They've figured out that, look, these understories are a really important reserve of high quality forage during drought because of the higher relative humidities. It's really interesting, but we don't necessarily think about those kinds of things. So the aspen forests represent a type of emergency forage during drought. Okay, now I'm going to get into the herbicide. So I apologize in advance because you're going to get a lot of data here, but I'm going to try to pull it together at the end, okay? So there's been roughly 4 or 5 studies that have really looked at how do we control these shrubs, either aspen, snowberry, or wild rose. And in the aspen in this context is regrowing aspen, okay? So it's regenerating aspen. So this first one was done by Bailey. We talked about it a little bit already. He basically compared 2 kilograms per hectare of 2,4-D, and he had a number of seeding treatments in here. I'm not going to worry too much about the seeding treatments. The thing I just want to draw your attention to, the blue bar and the gray bar are both sprayed. Okay, so you see the snowberry. So we're getting about half of the snowberry being controlled. See that? If you look at the wild rose, it almost looks like the spraying just made it worse. So one of the things that you have to be really aware of is that your target weed or your target shrub will determine the type of herbicide. And I'm going to drive this point home because I have lots and lots of examples of it. And then I'll pull it together on a conclusion slide where I'll point out what some of these overriding patterns are. The other thing that I want to pick out from Art Bailey's early work is because he had both non-seeded, so areas where he didn't do any overseeding, and then he had areas where he seeded smooth brome and rough fescue. And I just want to draw your attention, even if we just ignore the unsprayed, but if you look at the sprayed, we're looking at roughly, roughly 90 or 60 stems, sorry, in the areas that were seeded. Look at what happens if you don't seed. You're up around 100 to 150. So, there's this old saying that Mother Nature abhors a vacuum, right? There's always going to be something there. So if you weaken your forage stand, you are going to make the problem worse. So having a really competitive forage stand is critical to helping to control shrubs. And there's two options that you have to do that. One is overseed, make sure you have a good seed supply. But the other one is don't overgraze. Be aware if it gets dry and your vegetation starts getting stressed, don't leave them in there till you're right down to the green, right down to the ground, so that you can golf on it. Get those animals out of there and make sure that those forage plants remain competitive. Really, really important point. Okay. Okay, so there was a lot of work that was done, and it's really good work by Gary Bowes over in Saskatchewan, and he's got a couple of really cool studies that I want to talk about. So what he did here is he built on Art Bailey's work with 2,4-D, but he added in dicamba. So basically he's looking at 1.5 kilograms of dicamba mixed with 2.2 kilograms of 2,4-D, and he basically put it onto these different shrubs. And this is Western snowberry. Okay, that's one of your target weeds that you're worried about. And so I just want to point out, and there's two treatments here. There's one treatment where he sprayed only once. That's 1981 right here. So this is a single treatment. And this is a double treatment. He sprayed in 1981 and then again in 1983. Okay, so one of them is the double treatment, and you can see the additive effect of two treatments. And then there's this trajectory basically of 7 years of data. See that? The blue, orange, gray, and then yellow. So the first treatment did quite well. You can see that. You got good control, but if you didn't provide the second treatment, you see what happens. The snowberry's recovering. So snowberry, yes, you can get control with dicamba, and you can get kind of partial control with 2,4-D, as I showed you earlier, but it's a tough bugger to kill. It is not, and remember, cattle don't want to graze it. So grazing for biocontrol is not an option. So a 2 application treatment, one in 1981 or 2 years apart, worked quite well, okay? This is aspen, same exact trial, same exact data. Aspen's a wimp in comparison. Look at, I mean, one treatment basically blew it right out, which we already kind of knew, because we already knew that 2,4-D alone worked quite well. And when he combined dicamba and 2,4-D, he basically knocked it right out. And of course, the double treatment had the same impact. So again, if you're managing aspen, 2,4-D alone, maybe with dicamba would be plenty. If you're trying to control Western snowberry with dicamba 2,4-D, you're probably going to need 2 treatments, staggered a couple of years apart. Here's the grass production data. I always like to show the grass production data because producers want to see, am I getting anything back for my money? Here's the check data. You can see it bounces around. That's not surprising because this is weather variation. There's the one dose, and you see 2 things. Yes, you're getting a significant yield gain in grass production, but you're also seeing by 1987 and 1989, there's a bit of a downturn, okay? That's this red arrow. So we're starting to see it maybe subside a little bit. The 2 dose tends to retain its productivity a little bit better, especially in 85 and 89. If you look at the comparison from this blue bar to here, there's a net advantage. Okay, now whether that pencils out into a net return, that's up to you to decide based on how risk averse you are, how desperate you are to get rid of your snowberry, and you know what the recovery rate is and so on. Okay, Gary did another study. This was with metsulfuron. Now, metsulfuron is express, so that's the way it's marketed, at least here in Alberta. So it's used a lot on actually cropland. So he combined metsulfuron with 2,4-D in a factorial design. The bottom line from this is pretty straightforward. If you look at the 2,4-D alone, so the blue versus the orange, only getting about half the control. And that's consistent with what we saw earlier. But look at the metsulfuron. Even 3 grams per hectare of metsulfuron does a heck of a number on Western snowberry. So again, if you really want better control, metsulfuron is a probably better option than dicamba and 2,4-D. So again, you really have to cater the herbicides that you want to use to the shrubs that you're targeting. It's incredibly important. Here's the forage production data. Interestingly enough, this is untreated data over a, 8-year period, 7-year period. So for whatever reason, that maybe going through a wetter trend, so it's a little tricky to decipher this yield gain. You have to compare this blue bar to this blue bar. That's the only way to see the yield benefit. So the 3 grams per hectare did lead to greater productivity. You can see it from this gray bar to this one, this yellow bar to this one, and this blue bar to this one. But whether it pays for itself, again, that's up to the producer to decide. Every producer is going to have a different price point. He also looked at aspen response, and aspen responded really well to both 2,4-D. So here's the decline from just 2,4-D. And here's the effect of adding in some metsulfuron. So by and large, aspen is a wimp. If you're trying to control aspen regrowth, it's probably the easiest one to control. The harder ones are rose and especially the western snowberry. Okay, that's the take-home bottom line here. Here's some rose data. So they did collect some rose data, and interestingly, look what the 2,4-D did here. It did nothing. In fact, it almost made it worse. So prickly rose went from 7% to 10% cover. So if you're going to try to use 2,4-D to control a rose infestation, you're wasting your money. Don't even bother. You are totally wasting your money. However, metsulfuron worked, but look at the rate. The rate is extremely high. This is 15 grams per hectare. Whereas up here, we were looking at 3 grams, where is it? Right there, 3 grams per hectare for western snowberry. So by and large, that rose, at least using metsulfuron, is way harder to kill, way harder to kill. See that? Okay, so I have some kind of concluding points that I just want to make. So as a last resort, I combed through the literature just to see if I can find any other kind of snippets of information. I've worked with Grazon P plus D. This was a Dow product for many years. Now it's a Corteva product, I believe. Don't quote me on that, but which is basically picloram combined with 2,4-D. There was some early work done in the 1980s. I also used it in my thistle work. You'll hear about it in mid-March. Interestingly enough, they do not suggest that this will provide good control of, for example, rose, okay? What Switzer found is they got about 2 to 3 years of control on western snowberry, but when I look at my blue book, it's off-label. It does not say anything about western snowberry control. So I was very intrigued by that because now I don't know which is the right situation. Do I believe Switzer and Roll or do I believe the blue book? Now the blue book is basically what Corteva is telling us you should go with. So I'm not saying use it. I'm just saying that producers may have used this for other purposes, let's say for spurge control or tansy or whatever, and maybe you'll get a little bit of control on the western snowberry. Another one is Reclaim. So this is aminopyrrolid, which again, I believe is a Corteva product now, together with metsulfuron. So there's our metsulfuron making an appearance again. So that's the Express. And this will give you season-long control. And according to our blue book here in Alberta, our herbicide book, you'll get some action on rose at the higher concentrations. But this is very high concentrations of the Reclaim, 200 grams per hectare. At one time, there was the gold standard for much of the brush control in Alberta was Garlon, which is now Garlon XRT. So that's triclopyr basically is the active ingredient at 3 to 5 liters. I can't even find it. I know it's available, but I think it's only suggested for industrial use, okay? So I probably wouldn't go that route. Now, here's the exciting thing that I get to share with you, because I reached out to some folks at Bayer, because I'm doing a project on cheatgrass invasion in southern Alberta where we're controlling it. And they reported to me that they have a new product called True Range. And so it will have multiple rates of application, and I'll show them to you in a moment. The chemistry is aminocyclopyrrochlor. Aminocyclopyrrochlor is a closely related relative to AMP, aminopyrrolide. Okay, so it's related to Lontrell, it's related to picloram. It's not as long lasting in the soil as picloram. It's kind of in between. And what they've done is they've formulated the AMCP together with metsulfuron, which we've already been talking about. That's the Express. And they are reporting pretty good control on wild rose, snowberry, and potentially aspen. So this is what they sent me. This is direct from Megan Coverdale. So I've put her email on there, and she's told me if you guys want to reach out to her, have at it. So there you go. So it'll be intended for range and pasture use, 24-month, so broad spectrum, broadleaf and brush control. So it'll control a lot of those hard to kill things like scentless chamomile, knapweed, leafy spurge. So this might be attractive to quite a few people. At the low rate, which is 67 grams per hectare, you do get control of Western snowberry and wild rose. This caught my eye because, as we just talked about, there's not that many products that simultaneously will get both of them, okay? And you do need a higher rate to get control of aspen. Now, I asked about availability. She told me it's being available in Alberta through, I think, 15 retailers. There's limited availability through BC this summer. I think it's only 2 to 3 or 2 to 4. But next year, it'll be much more widely available. So if you're really interested in this, I suggest you talk to your local agronomist, or you reach out to Megan directly and find out whether you can get your hands on this and try it. And again, they openly say you may get regrowth in 3 to 4 years. And so again, this is entirely your call and whether you want to try this. Megan did send me a picture contrast. This is some work they did this year. Here's a trial from Cremona. This is 30 days post-spraying. So you can see this is Western snowberry right here. So this is treated, this is untreated, and this is 90 days post-spraying. So, I mean, it looks pretty good. I also asked about price point because most producers go, what is it going to cost me? I understand it's going to be around $30 an acre. That's not cheap. But again, if you have such a significant rose and buckbrush problem, so again, I go back to where I started my talk, that it's really about integrated control. If you need a kickstart to get this going, you're probably going to have to use a herbicide. But don't rule out the importance of using proper grazing management thereafter to make sure that you can control the woody regrowth that tends to come back. Because as I said, you know, Mother Nature abhors a vacuum, and the best defense is a good offense. Have a really productive grass stand, which will help suppress the woody species. Okay, a few closing comments. Herbicide should be timed to when leaves basically have expanded. On these plants, it's usually kind of latter part of June or early July, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to catch the plant with a very low level of root reserves, okay? Use higher water volumes. Megan stressed that to me, and this is what I've read as well. You cannot get away with 10 gallons an acre. You have to go to 20 gallons. And the reason for that is to get really good coverage on the shrubs, because there's so much leaf area. If you don't get good coverage, you're not going to get good control. There's a little bit of work. This is Barry Adams's, actually from his master's work, suggesting that mowing of Western snowberry and then letting it regrow and then spraying it may give you better control. Again, I'm not going to make a recommendation on it, but think about it. Maybe that's an option. See, because again, what you're doing is you're knocking the mature plants down, forcing it to regrow, and then when it's vulnerable, you're clobbering it with the herbicide. Pay attention to the grazing restrictions. Many of these have either no grazing restriction or very little grazing restriction. So a withdrawal period to market or things like that. Most of them are pretty good. And I know that the true range is the same way. Okay, so here's my conclusion slide. So I didn't even get the green light yet from Serena, so I know I'm still okay. So the reality is, yeah, we can lose quite a bit of forage. We can lose 20%, we can lose 40, 60, even 80% of forage. Having said that, Some of these woody species, in particular aspen when it's young, can actually be a pretty good source of forage. And some of these aspen stands can have benefits. So I would encourage you to think about integrating them into your kind of agro-ecosystem as you manage your whole setup. Proper stocking rates are really important to make sure that you don't make a bad problem worse. You know, this notion that a good defense is a good offense, and having a really vigorous forage stand is important to suppress the success of those woody plant invasions. Prescribed fire and follow-up rotational grazing can work, but probably not for Western snowberry, and it's probably not going to be largely adopted on a large scale just because of the risk and the expertise. There's not many people that have the ability to do this. So I'm not telling you to run out and start everything on fire, okay? This is being recorded, so I'm on record now as telling you, don't run out and start everything on fire, okay? But maybe there's someone in your area that does prescribe burning work, and maybe they're willing to do that. Maybe they have a contract outfit, okay? Herbicides work, but they vary in effectiveness depending on the target woody plant. If it's aspen suckers, you can get away with 2,4-D, maybe with a little bit of dicamba. It works quite well. Snowberry, you're going to need metsulfuron or this dicamba plus 2,4-D, but then you might need 2 applications, or you might try the true range. Again, I don't know the data on the true range. I haven't seen the data, so I'm not speaking for it. You can make up your own mind. Rose, a real tough one to kill. It's going to need a really heavy rate of metsulfuron. So again, cater your control to the individual species. Okay, that's what I've got.